London, 1888. The capital of the British Empire is in the eyes of the world, the epicenter of civilization, commerce, and industrial progress. But if we walk just a few kilometers to the east, far from the palaces and the gaslit avenues of the West End, reality completely crumbles. Welcome to Whitechapel. In this forgotten corner, the fog is not just a meteorological phenomenon. It is a shroud that hides one of the darkest and most analyzed pages of criminal history. A series of brutal murders not only ended the lives of 5 women, but also fractured the psyche of an entire nation and gave birth to the archetype of the modern serial killer. I am John Crime, and welcome to a new dissection. Today we are not going to tell ghost stories to pass the time. We are going to dissect the myth. We are going to separate forensic data from Victorian rumor, and we are going to understand why, more than 130 years later, the name Jack the Ripper continues to resonate in our deepest nightmares. If you think you know this story, prepare yourselves, because reality is much more complex, raw, and, above all, much less clear than what we have been told in movies or popular fiction. Let us begin the dissection. To dissect the killer, we must first understand the environment that allowed him to act. Whitechapel in 1888 was not just a poor neighborhood, it was a social cesspool. Imagine a place where overcrowding reached inhuman levels, where entire families shared a single room, and where desperation was the only real currency. Precarity was absolute in the district, with a devastating unemployment rate that forced many people to take refuge in lodging houses, which became the last link in the chain of survival for thousands of people, including the victims we will analyze soon. Alcoholism was endemic, being almost the only physical and mental escape from a daily reality that offered no dignified exit for its inhabitants. Furthermore, it is fundamental to emphasize the Victorian upper class's view of Whitechapel. It was a look of absolute contempt, as they considered its inhabitants second-class citizens or directly disposable, which partly explains the slowness and ineffectiveness of the initial police response to the crimes. On the other hand, we must not forget the failure of authority itself. It is a verified historical fact that the London Metropolitan Police suffered from a severe lack of resources and operational coordination at that time. To this was added a sterile administrative rivalry with the city police, which made it difficult to share key information between jurisdictions when the murders began to occur. Forensic science was literally in its infancy. There was no fingerprinting as a method of identification, there was no DNA analysis, and there was not even a standardized protocol for preserving the crime scene, which allowed Jack to operate in an environment where physical evidence was practically non-existent. This was the perfect breeding ground, a scenario where the police were overwhelmed by bureaucracy, technology was insufficient, and a large part of the population was invisible to the authorities. In this vacuum of power and oversight, Jack found his perfect hunting ground. To understand the true dimension of this case, we must abandon the idea of the victims as simple names on a list. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were women of flesh and blood whose lives were cut short in the most violent way imaginable. Their common denominator was extreme precarity, absolute vulnerability in a London that turned its back on them, and, above all, a geographical location that made them the perfect targets for a predator who knew the weakness of his environment. Let us begin with Mary Ann Nichols, whose death, occurring in the early hours of August 31, 1888, marked the beginning of what the press would call the Whitechapel Terror. Nichols, known to her acquaintances as Polly, was a 43-year-old woman who, after a failed marriage and a series of personal misfortunes, found herself living in misery, inhabiting lodging houses, and seeking occasional income wherever she could. That night, Polly was looking for a place to sleep in the Whitechapel area, an area where hardship was the norm and safety and non-existent luxury. Her body was found on Bucks Row, a rarely traveled street where the silence of the early morning was only interrupted by the distant sound of horses. The forensic dissection of the crime scene, carried out with the limited means of the time, revealed a brutality that surpassed any criminal act recorded until that moment in the area. The wounds were not simple cuts. They showed a clear intention to dehumanize the victim, a trait that would become Jack's signature. The precision of the cut to her throat and the abdominal mutilation suggested that the killer did not act out of a simple fit of rage, but followed a meticulous pattern that pointed to someone with anatomical knowledge, or at least with a technical coldness that terrified Scotland Yard investigators. Just a week later, on September 8, the tragedy repeated itself. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who shared similar life circumstances with Polly, was found dead in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Annie, like Nichols, was a woman punished by life who tried to survive day by day in an increasingly dangerous environment. Chapman's crime scene was, if possible, even more chilling for the police officers who arrived at the scene. Here, the Ripper went much further. He not only limited himself to making the fatal incisions, but proceeded to perform an extraction of internal organs with a methodology that, for many experts of the time, revealed access to the body and manual skill unbecoming of a simple street criminal. This level of skill was precisely what fueled, from the very first moment, the surgeon theory. The investigators were paralyzed by the coldness of the execution, as the body had been manipulated in a courtyard where families slept just a few meters away, oblivious to the barbarity that was occurring. The impossibility of hearing anything, the absence of witnesses, and the speed with which the killer disappeared into the night reinforced the idea that Jack was not just a murderer, but a ghost who knew the streets of Whitechapel, the escape routes, and the patrol times of a police force that, by all accounts, always arrived late. The carnage did not stop there. but reached a level of frenzy that marked the early hours of September 30th, a date that case analysts know as the double murder event. It all began in Dutfield's yard, where Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered shortly after midnight. Elizabeth, a woman of Swedish origin who had struggled for years against poverty and alcoholism, was found with a clean cut to her throat, but, curiously, her body did not present the abdominal mutilations that had become the killer's hallmark until that moment. The main theory among investigators of the time was that the Ripper was probably interrupted by the arrival of a witness or the sound of a nearby carriage, which forced him to flee before completing his macabre ritual. However, what makes this night truly terrifying is that the killer was not satisfied, as less than an hour later and a short distance away, at Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes' body was found. If with Stride the killer was forced to escape, with Eddowes he took a bloody revenge, executing a mutilation so deep and methodical that it left the local police breathless. Catherine's face was marked by precise incisions, and her organs had been extracted with a coldness that once again put the suspicion of an expert hand on the table, someone who not only knew where to cut, but understood human anatomy with a clarity that terrified the forensic experts of the time. The figure of Catherine Eddowes is particularly tragic, not only because of the violence of her end, but because that very day she had spent several hours in police custody for being drunk, being released upon regaining sobriety, without anyone suspecting that, just a few minutes after regaining her freedom on the streets of London, she would cross paths with the darkest fate in all of Whitechapel. With this double murder, Jack the Ripper ceased to be a simple criminal from the alleys to become a threat that defied the entire police structure of the metropolis, forcing the authorities to admit, for the first time, that they were facing a predator who not only knew the terrain, but seemed to constantly mock their attempts at capture. Media pressure reached unbearable levels, newspapers began to publish special editions, and fear settled into every home in the East End, where women avoided going out at night and men patrolled the streets organized in improvised vigilance committees. The collective psychology of the city changed that autumn, moving from morbid curiosity to a paralyzing terror that affected everyone from the humblest worker to the highest offices of government. Finally, we must turn our gaze toward the end of this series of canonical murders with the figure of Mary Jane Kelly, whose case represents the zenith of the Ripper's brutality and, in turn, the greatest mystery of the case. Unlike the other victims, Kelly was murdered on November 9th inside her own room, at Miller's Court, a closed environment that suggests a progression in the killer's audacity. While the previous victims were surprised in public or open courtyards, Mary Jane Kelly's death occurred behind a closed door, which implies that the killer had the necessary time, absolute tranquility, and total control of the scene to carry out a practically surgical dissection of his victim. When the police forced entry the next day, they were met with a scene that surpassed any logical description. The level of mutilation was so extreme and the dismemberment so exhaustive that, more than a murder, it seemed like the work of someone who had lost all trace of humanity and sought, through violence, to reach a level of absolute terror that no one in London could ever forget. Kelly's death marked the final point of the streak of canonical crimes, leaving behind a deathly silence in Whitechapel and opening the door to decades of speculation, theories, and desperate searches for a culprit who, to this day, seems to have vanished into the very fog that covered the streets of that Victorian London. Now that we have dissected the crudeness of the scenes and the undeniable tragedy of the 5 canonical victims, we must focus on the figure of the killer and the names that history has placed under the magnifying glass of suspicion. It is crucial to clarify, from a position of analytical rigor, that there is not a single conclusive piece of evidence that definitively links any of these individuals to the crimes, but it is precisely this vacuum of physical evidence that has allowed the myth to grow for more than a century. One of the names that has resonated most in modern research is that of Aaron Kosminski, a barber of Polish origin who resided in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. Kosminski appears in the police files of Scotland Yard as one of the main suspects identified by investigators of the time, being described as a man with misogynistic tendencies and mental health problems that led him, finally, to be interned in a psychiatric institution. At the beginning of the 21st century, certain mitochondrial DNA studies obtained from a shawl, supposedly linked to Catherine Eddowes' crime scene, suggested a possible match with Kosminski's lineage, however. This finding has been harshly criticized by the scientific community and forensic historians due to the lack of a clear chain of custody for said textile piece and the extremely high risk of cross-contamination from having been handled for decades. Another name that we cannot overlook in this dissection is that of Montague John Druitt, a lawyer and teacher who, curiously, committed suicide just a few weeks after the murders abruptly ceased. For some inspectors of the time, the fact that the Ripper stopped acting suspiciously coincided with the disappearance and subsequent death of Druitt, which led later theorists to suggest that his suicide was the result of guilt or the fear of being discovered. But once again, we must insist that this is a deduction based on a temporal coincidence and not on proven fact. Druitt's figure was promoted as a suspect by Chief Inspector Macnaghten in his internal reports years later, but lacked a solid foundation beyond the speculative suspicion of those who desperately sought to close a case that was humiliating the London police before public opinion. To this list is also added Francis Tumblety, an American charlatan who was in London during the Autumn of Terror and possessed a documented history of extreme hatred toward women, as well as an erratic behavior that raised suspicions even among his acquaintances. Tumblety was interrogated by the police, but managed to leave England and return to the United States before charges could be filed against him, which generated theories that the police let him escape due to incompetence or a lack of real evidence to detain him under Victorian laws. Beyond these suspects, there is the fascinating but highly speculative trend that points to a connection with the highest spheres of British society, including rumors that involve members of the royal family, such as Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. These conspiracy theories, which have been the engine of countless works of fiction and books, suggest that Jack the Ripper was a cover-up designed to protect the honor of the crown, implicating court physicians and a state machinery of silence that would have erased any trace of the killer. Although these stories are extremely popular and fit perfectly into the narrative of an untouchable killer, they lack any serious documentary backing and crumble before a historical analysis that proves the prince was far from London on several of the critical dates of the murders. The dissection of these suspects leads us inevitably to conclude that, while many had the psychological profile or geographical opportunity to commit these crimes, none of them fit the totality of the limited evidence we have today. The Ripper benefits from anonymity, the absence of modern forensic evidence in 1888, and our own human need to put a face to absolute evil to feel that, in some way, we have controlled the chaos. To understand why Jack remains an enigma, we must perform a technical dissection of the scientific shortcomings of 1888 compared to our current capacity, as much of the myth is sustained precisely on the forensic ignorance of that time. If we today had a single biological sample from the scenes of Hanbury Street or Mitre Square, the dissection of the killer's identity would be a matter of hours thanks to DNA sequencing, a technology that has turned what was previously a dead end into a highway of irrefutable evidence. At that time, the concept of fingerprinting as forensic evidence was barely in its theoretical infancy, and was not used systematically in criminal investigations until years later, which means that the Ripper could have touched dozens of surfaces at the crime scenes without leaving a single trace identifiable by Scotland Yard investigators. To this we must add the total absence of standardized blood tests or protocols for the preservation of fluids, which caused scenes to be contaminated by onlookers, journalists, and police agents who, with the best of intentions but without the necessary technical preparation, ended up destroying any minuscule evidence that could have betrayed the culprit. If we imagine the same scenario moved to the 21st century, Jack would not have been a ghost, but an individual traceable through his genetic profile, his fingerprints, and, probably, through the analysis of digital location data that today form part of any standard criminal investigation. This technological gap is, ultimately, the true veil that protects Jack. The Ripper was not a perfect criminal, but simply the beneficiary of a justice system that walked blindly in a world that did not yet know how to extract the truth from the biological remains left behind by violence. The phenomenon of Jack the Ripper cannot be understood without analyzing the crucial role played by the press of the time in the construction and expansion of the myth. In a London where literacy was booming, sensationalist newspapers, such as the famous Star, quickly understood that fear sold copies on a scale never seen before. It was in this context that the famous letters sent to the police and news agencies appeared, with a letter headed by the greeting, "Dear Boss," being the one that officially baptized the killer with the name that has made him immortal. It is vital to maintain a stance of historical skepticism toward these documents, as the vast majority of contemporary experts agree that they were inventions created by unscrupulous journalists for the sole purpose of fueling collective hysteria and ensuring the commercial success of their publications. These texts, far from being genuine clues, functioned as a macabre marketing tool that transformed a common murderer into a theatrical character, giving him a face and a personality that, in reality, never existed. Information manipulation was so effective that it managed to make the population feel that the killer was an omniscient entity that constantly mocked the authorities, when in reality, it is most likely that he was an opportunistic criminal who took advantage of media coverage to hide behind the thunder of the headlines. The ineffectiveness of law enforcement must also be dissected coldly, moving away from legend to focus on the structural limitations of 1888. Scotland Yard was facing a challenge for which it had neither preparation nor tools. There was no centralized database, communication between the East and Centre police stations was archaic, and, most importantly, the concept of the crime scene as a sacred space for the collection of evidence did not yet exist in the minds of agents. In many cases, the arrival of police officers at the places where the bodies were found ended up destroying possible clues or traces that the killer might have left behind, because personnel were not trained to preserve biological or physical evidence. Furthermore, the absence of a methodology to establish a clear criminal profile meant that investigators chased shadows rather than facts, wasting resources on random arrests based on social prejudices or the mere appearance of suspects rather than solid forensic evidence. Jack was not a criminal mastermind who outsmarted Scotland Yard through superior intelligence, but was a man who knew how to navigate a judicial and police system that was completely overwhelmed and that, ultimately, lacked the technical capabilities necessary to face a predator of his characteristics. Reaching the end of this journey, we face an uncomfortable truth. The Jack the Ripper case remains open not for lack of suspects, but for an absolute lack of certainty. The fascination we feel for this Victorian murderer is, ultimately, a reflection of our own fears of the unknown and the possibility that evil can run wild without ever finding punishment. By dissecting this myth, what we are really observing is a society that was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, where wealth and misery coexisted at such a short distance that it allowed tragedy to hide in the shadows of the very same street. Jack the Ripper has ceased to be a man to become a mirror where we project our anxieties about security, justice, and the state's capacity to protect us from that which we cannot see. If this dissection has taught us anything, it is that we must distrust official versions and narratives that are presented as absolute truths, because history is, to a large extent, an incomplete puzzle where each piece we find forces us to question everything we previously believed we knew. The fog of Whitechapel may have dissipated long ago, but the trail of questions it left in its wake remains, reminding us that in the abyss of history, answers are often much more disappointing than the mystery we try to solve. I am John Crime, and this has been the forensic analysis of the bloodiest legend of Victorian London. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the darkest corners of the criminal record, and do not forget that, sometimes, reality is much more unsettling than fiction. Until the next dissection.